Right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming back. Welcome to week 2 of the Adaptation Planning and Practices course. So again, thanks for joining. We are going to be, we are recording, so please mute yourself, turn on your cameras, and we'll kind of talk about what we have on the docket for today. So again, just thanks all for coming. Today, I'm Maria Genoviak with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, and I'll be working with Danielle Shannon today as your primary course instructors and leads again, but we'll be switching it up in coming weeks. And in terms of what we have on the agenda today, the purpose for today is really to focus on interesting step 2 of the adaptation workbooks. You've seen kind of now through the course where each week we introduce another step of the adaptation workbook. So week 2 is step 2. We'll be talking about climate change impacts and specifically talking about how do you gather information on climate change impacts and think about how those affect your project area. We'll also describe the assignment for next week. What we'll do is we'll focus first on the lecture regarding step 2 because we record that and we want to make sure that's available to everyone. But then as we finish out the session for today, we'll have additional time for troubleshooting and asking any questions you might have on step 1 so far. Danielle and I have been looking at, along with the other course instructors, we've been looking at your projects so far, looking at the homeworks that have been completed. There's a lot of really excellent projects. Every year, the quality of the projects gets better. The questions people are asking get better and better. And so we're really excited for that. And we're, again, happy to help troubleshoot, answer your questions for anything at the end of the lecture today. Just in terms of where we are located, where you are all located, your projects, Danielle put together this map giving a sense of project numbers in each of the different states so we can see the distribution. Go Michigan! In terms of having the most number of projects. You can see we have a lot of people from the Midwest and Northeast, which really is kind of a lot of our NIAC's core area, but we have people from other regions as well. So it's really great to have all of you here. I don't know, Danielle, if you wanted to say anything else, feel free.
Oh, it just occurred to me that I didn't check that Western geography. I'm terrible at Western geography. I'm a Northeast person, so excuse me if I got your state incorrect.
Yes, you got someone state. And we, because we want, and then 2 in Canada. Yes, thank you. And they're actually not terribly far apart if I remember right. So we got 2 there. So thank you. All right. This week, as I mentioned, is step 2. So by now you're getting used to where this sits in terms of the adaptation workbook. Step 1, again, we were just really focusing on identifying what those projects were, identifying your goals and objectives. Many of you have that completed. Maybe you're kind of trying to figure out exactly what a goal is and an objective, but no problems there. Today, what we'll really be thinking about is now that you've kind of picked your project area, drawn your polygon on a map, or put your pin on a map, really thinking about how does climate change affect that area. And so we've shared some resources with you last week to get you started, and we'll talk more about those today and really think about not only how does climate change affect the region broadly, but it's really drilling down and thinking about how climate change affects the lands that you're working in specifically. So the step 2 questions, I think I pretty much just said these, but the first one is what climate change impacts and vulnerabilities are most important to your project area? So again, we're really trying to think about how do we take kind of big, broad, trends across large areas and drill them down to, places that you really care about, someplace that you could actually stand and look at and think about. And then how vulnerable is your project area? And we have a vulnerability determination step, and we'll be describing that as well. So step 2 has really kind of 2 parts to it. We'll discuss these in a little bit more detail, but again, the big idea that we want to get across, again, is just really thinking about how do we take these regional resources, which Danielle will share some of these in a moment, really think about how do we take these regional resources, all of the information that's available, and then use your expertise, your knowledge of local ecosystems, places to think about what climate change impacts matter most where you live and work. So we'll break that apart a little bit later in this lecture, but first I'm going to turn it over to Danielle to talk a little bit about some of the resources that are available for understanding those broad climate change impacts.
Right. And so Maria mentioned, you know, there are two parts to this step, and we'll cover both of those parts in this lecture. The first is the assessment of regional climate impacts that are drawn from literature, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. And, you know, in this first section, we're going to start talking about gathering information, and you can gather all sorts of information that help you explore, you know, some of the key characteristics of your site, from maps, topography information, DEMs, you know, any type of GIS spatial information that will really give you that clue into, you know, how is this place oriented? Where are the ravines? What type of forest vegetation or wetland ecosystems do I have on site? You know, we're talking about gathering information, but we're not talking about gathering all of the information, right? We're looking at trying to get enough on our plate so that we understand this place, and it can really help us, you know, that information can help us identify and prioritize those key threats and vulnerabilities that might affect the land that we're thinking about. Okay, so we have a few slides that will go into more detail on those resources and might help you feel a little less overwhelmed. So this is our short list. This is not the end all be all. After this presentation, just be happy because the previous year's people had a much longer presentation with like a fire hose of tools. But we'll go into more detail on tools at the optional session on Wednesday. Okay, so we want to start step 2 of the adaptation workbook by, you know, beginning to assess how climate change may affect our area. So using the online adaptation workbook, you'll actually be served up a list of preloaded climate change summary statements. These are automatically built into the adaptation workbook. So, you know, regional climate impacts are provided for your project's location. When you started the adaptation workbook, you actually defined your project's location by dropping that pin on a map. Seems like a long time ago, but it wasn't. The adaptation workbook then uses that location in a geographic, like a regional sense, just to say, where are you located? And then it will pull together a list of climate impacts relevant to your project's region. And all of these climate impacts, this list, will be drawn from regional vulnerability assessments, noted in green on that map. These are the eco-regional assessments that NIAX has created. We'll talk about those in a minute. And the areas in blue are the national climate assessment areas. So no matter where you're located, you will get a huge list of resources. And really your first priority is to open up this list, start reading through these, start reviewing these climate impacts by reading each one and thinking about how that impact might affect the place that you care about. And then you can use that comment bubble that Maria is sort of hovering near to expand on that and to say, okay, well, you know, low diversity systems are a greater risk from climate change, and that's going to affect my area because I don't have a lot of diversity. I have, you know, this pine plantation, whatever it is. You step that down and you comment deliberately right there. Also, we want to invite you to take time to explore the supporting information for each statement, and you can click on the Show Evidence button. It looks like a little eye symbol that we've highlighted there, and Maria's showing you with the cursor. So once you click that, you'll see a pop-up, and it'll just give you a lot of information that help to really expand on what that short statement means, and it'll give you links to all of the resources that are used to create that statement. And lastly, if you think any of the suggested impacts on this list just don't apply, like maybe you get a sea level rise one and you are definitely inland, use that X icon on the side to just get rid of it. And it doesn't get rid of it forever, it just puts it away, but you can add it back later if you go back in and you're like, oh, actually that impact is pretty important to my project area. Sometimes in a workshop we'll say, think of your top 5, you know, first, and then sort of X out all of the others. And then you can slowly bring those back in after you've identified your top impacts of concern.
I have a
Okay,
quick question.
sure.
This is Luke Grand. Can you go back to the previous slide? How did they determine that North Dakota and Texas would have the same climate change summary region?
Actually, we'll get to that in a little bit, but correct, we need to change, I think, how that looks on the screen, on the back end. So what you're seeing with the different variations of blue is how the National Climate Assessment organized the regions. And back in the 2013 document, they did create this like long line that makes no sense geographically north to south. But in the newest version, in the 2018, they actually did split it. So there's a northern and a southern plains region. And the data that we've put into the adaptation workbook is drawn from that newer assessment. And so it does reflect a difference in geography. Okay, so let's move into the green spots on the map. So some areas, if you're located in the Midwest and the Northeast, are going to have a little bit more information than some of the areas located outside. So first, let's look at those areas. The areas that are noted in all the beautiful colors here, these are the ecoregions in the Midwest and Northeast that will have finer scaled climate change impacts because they're drawn from our eco-regional forest ecosystem vulnerability assessments. And these are huge undertakings involving, great collaboration between sometimes hundreds of partners that come together to really speak to the forest systems located in these different states along these ecoregional lines. So if you are looking to just follow up on that, learn more about that, you can click on the link below or even find this in your course syllabus, a link to all of the different geographic vulnerability assessments. And within those, you'll find, a full range of future climate projections in addition to vulnerability of major forest types and the natural ecosystems that are present in those regions. These assessments can create a really solid baseline of just relevant, science-based, peer-reviewed information, but they don't make recommendations or even address how to respond to climate change. But they do get into management implications. So if you're interested and you haven't read these, we highly suggest you go and check those out. So again, look in your course syllabus. Now, if your project does fall within one of those big giant NIAX ecoregional assessment areas in the Midwest or the Northeast, and you have selected a forest type in step 1, you'll see not only regional climate change impacts, but then you'll start to see these forest type specific impacts. And so I just wanted to let you know where those come from. Those come from these ecoregional vulnerability assessments. And there's an example of what the Northeast assessment looks like on the side there. So, once you've selected your forest type, in this case, transition hardwoods, you will see this, another similar list of climate impacts, but are really specific to this forest type. And you can click on the eye icon to, explore the supporting evidence, learn a little bit more about the statement, or even delete any of these that just don't seem like they make sense for your project area. It's just a neat little add-on that some regions get. Unfortunately, that's not available for all of you. So next slide. And so for areas that are outside of the Midwest and Northeast, shown in this map in blue, we're bringing you something. We've synthesized those climate change impacts from the National Climate Assessment and are actually working with some regional partners to create a more finer scaled list of impacts, but that's ongoing work right now. So what you'll find right now are statements that are pulled from the National Climate Assessment, and we've given you the link so that you can explore those chapters even more so. Once you get your head around it and you start looking at this, I'm going to just sort of warn you ahead of time that this list, although drawn from a very science-based, credible, and relevant resource, it describes big trends. These are across huge multi-state regions, and so the reports are big and they're meant to be big. So in a lot of ways, you might feel like the list is a little bare bones. And so if that's the case, we do invite you to create your own climate change impacts that pulls from more locally relevant reports that is not necessarily, goes into more detail. And we have a little option for you to create your own climate impact. And when you do that, it asks you to paste in a link so that you can cite it in your work as well. For folks in these blue areas on the map, we have included many curated little lists for you that will help to draw you to the places where you might find additional resources on forests or wetlands or aquatic and water resources for your region. So just check into that course syllabus and find a link. And if you can't, feel free to reach out to Maria or I. And so if you're working in an urban area, and you're looking for maybe tree species information that's not included in the broader assessment, it's just not coming up for you. It might be the case that we have summarized climate change and tree species projections for your city. And we're working on expanding our network for urban cities in the Midwest, Northeast, and even in other areas. So, the most comprehensive assessment that we've done so far is for Chicago and for the city of Austin, Texas, but additional information is found for Boston, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, the Twin Cities, and I think several cities in Missouri and Indiana as well. So check into our website and you might find a really nice handy list of climate projections for different species, tree species. And lastly, I'll let Maria also talk about this, but I just wanted to remind you that if you are looking for more resources or just really want to interrogate and understand where some of these climate change tree species projections are coming from and what that's all about, check out our optional session this Wednesday, February 3rd at 11 o'clock. And, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about tree species, climate projections that are relevant to all states in the eastern region. So that's actually the Midwest, Northeast, and the southern region. So anybody who's interested should come. Please use the same URL and login information that you used today to attend that meeting. And we'll coach you through how to use the tool, the U.S. Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas, and also describe how you can assess climate impacts for species using just projected heat and hardiness zone data. And that might be really handy for folks who have like herbaceous species or shrubs that are just not being caught by those bigger models. So yeah, we encourage everyone to attend on this Wednesday.
Yeah, and I don't have really anything much to add to that. I think we used to try and get a lot of the content that will be in Wednesday's session into this lecture, and it was sort of one of those things where it was too much for one day, and some people felt like they didn't want it, and some people did. So we've decided to just create its own special session. We will record it as well, but it's really good and helpful if you're trying to dig deeper into understanding how individual tree or plant species could be vulnerable to climate change, and then it's also a basis for thinking, once you start thinking about individual species, it's also a basis for if you think you might be looking at targeting different species in your adaptation when we get to step 4. So it can be a bit foundational for that as well. So just making you sure that that's available, and we'll have one of the scientists who developed the tool available. Will be joining and presenting as well.
I have one comment as well, just to make you all aware. I think there was kind of a rush to get the Iowa publication out. There was like a PDF about the different trees that might be more suitable or less suitable, better capable of adaptation. Man, my read on it just doesn't make any sense. Like, I just wonder if maybe like somebody could follow up and look at that again, or maybe could I bring that with me to that session? We could kind of go through some of the questions I have.
Yeah, Luke, we should just schedule a call separately and we'll work it out between you and I and our colleague Todd.
Great. All right. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about how do we assess site level impacts and vulnerabilities. And so the idea here is, again, we want you to be familiar with the climate change information. Some of you may have been reading up on this information for years and be completely up on it. Some of you, might be, this is your first time thinking about climate change in terms of how it affects ecosystems. And so we, want to make sure you take the time to get up to speed on the science through the impact statements that are in the workbook and the other resources. That's why we've pulled together resource pages that highlight kind of the key resources for each region. So definitely check those out if you need more of that basic understanding. Once you have that, again, we want to take this time to really think about how do you apply regional information and think about how it affects your particular project area, because we know that each place on the landscape is going to be affected really differently depending on your landform and where you are on the landscape and all of the different site factors that you have going in past land use legacy and management history. All these things are really going to contribute to the uniqueness of your site, and you're going to have more information about that than anybody else. And so we can't tell you how vulnerable your site's going to be. And so this is where you're going to put some of that filter onto it yourself. So again, we're really asking in the step, what climate change impacts and vulnerabilities are most important to your project area, and helping you think about how vulnerable it is overall. So step 2.1 is in two parts. The first one is this climate impacts and vulnerabilities. And this is essentially where we take that regional climate change information and we think about how it affects your site level. So that's those dialogues that Danielle showed you, where if you're in one of anywhere in the US, and I'm sorry to those in Canada, you're gonna have to enter that information a little bit on your own, but when you drop your pin on the map, it's going to say, okay, based on your location, here is a summary of some regional climate impacts for your area. And then you're going to do that process of Xing out the ones that don't matter, adding comment bubbles, to put in any additional detail to the ones that do matter. You can add your own based on what's going to be important to you. If you have, so you'll have a lot of ability to document the site-specific impacts in step 2. We want you to do this, spend as much time as makes sense for you and your project. I would say, again, we really want this course to be practical, useful, and so, don't get bogged down in step 2 if you don't want to. It's really meant to be, use it at whatever level you think is helpful. And so if you want to kind of do a quick and dirty assessment of which of those impacts matter and move on, that's fine. If you really want to look at each one and think about it because this is the time to do that, that's fine too. In terms of it, here's an example. This is from a property that was somewhere in the Northeast. So some of the regional climate impacts that came up for this particular project are, one is a shorter, milder winter season. So that's something we're really expected to see everywhere, particularly in the Northeast and Midwest. We're seeing winter temperatures that are already a couple degrees warmer than they were at the turn of the previous century. That's expected to continue. So it's, something that we're dealing with broadly across pretty much everywhere I think everyone is located. In this particular site, the reason that they were concerned about warmer winter temperatures was really because they had hemlock forests, and they were really worried about this situation of less severe winters increasing the risk from hemlock woolly adelgid, because they don't have those severe winter temperatures that cause mortality of the insect. And they were in an area where the insect could potentially move north and affect their property. So regional impact is warmer temperature, but for them, they were really concerned about the hemlock. Other people might be concerned about winter access and operability, or particular target species being at risk. So it's going to vary based on where you are. Another regional impact that we're seeing is warmer annual temperatures. Again, many places are several degrees warmer than they were even 100 years ago. And here again, they're focused on hemlock. This project was focused on riparian areas, and so they really identified that the reason they were concerned about warmer annual temperatures was the warmer stream temperatures and the potential for that to affect cold water fisheries. And so this is sort of an example, is really thinking about, here's a general impact, but what does it matter where you are? Okay. The second step of 2.2 is that for each of your management topics, ecosystem types, land uses that you entered into step 1, however you divided your property or project area across into sort of any sort of subunits, you're going to rate, do a vulnerability determination where you rate the vulnerability of that system. And so this, I'll describe what this process looks like and kind of why we do it in a little bit more detail. But I think, really what this can be valuable for is, let's say that you have a project area that has 4 forest types or 4 units. You can get a relative sense of how vulnerable is each one, maybe, and identify those that are more vulnerable than others. So this is what that looks like, and just to really help you think a little bit more about what we mean by vulnerability. So the definition of vulnerability is the degree to which a system is susceptible to, unable to cope with the adverse effects of climate change, including climate variability and extremes. So that's the definition, but really it's thinking about, how much is climate change going to, disrupt or affect your particular project area? There are 2 components to vulnerability. One is potential impacts, and the other is adaptive capacity. I'm going to describe each of these in a little bit more detail, but this is a pretty common framework that we used in our vulnerability assessments, and a lot of other vulnerability assessments do as well. So this is pretty common in terms of thinking about climate change vulnerability. And I think it can be helpful because you can kind of identify the different, be like cogs that can influence overall vulnerability. So potential impacts, which is one of the components of vulnerability, really is actually a combination of 2 things. One is what the system is exposed to, what your project area is exposed to. So that could be changes in temperature, rainfall, or storms, and also how sensitive the system is to those changes. So, we're really thinking about, when we talk about potential impacts, is, are the impacts from climate change going to support an ecosystem, help it continue to be what it is, or are they going to disrupt a system on the whole? And so we can, really think about kind of on that spectrum of, how much do we expect that climate change impacts, how much of a perturbation are they going to be? How disruptive are they going to be? Or is climate change maybe actually going to be a good thing for a particular ecosystem? So an example is we can think about a large area, experiencing 3 degrees of warming. An alpine forest composed of spruce trees may be more sensitive to this impact than a forest of oak trees, because they're adapted to that really like northern high elevation alpine condition. Those tree species might be more sensitive. And so they'll be, even though the exposure is technically the same, they're experiencing the same 3 degrees. Adaptive capacity is essentially the definition of resilience. It's asking how well can the system cope with potential impacts. And so, assuming kind of no change or management intervention, or kind of maybe a status quo sort of management, will the system be able to cope with any of these impacts that happen? Is it going to be able to bounce back? So you can kind of start to see now, how do these things relate in terms of both, the impacts and the adaptive capacity. So an adaptive capacity example, kind of one that's pretty classic, is that a forest containing many species may have greater capacity to adapt to warming or to other changes than a forest containing 1 species. Not always maybe the case, but really this idea of spreading your eggs across multiple baskets, you would expect a more diverse forest to be more resilient overall, because it's going to have different functions and different capacities to be able to adapt to the change. And so again, you can kind of start to see how these 2 relate, but we separate them out because they interact differently. So you can imagine where you could have really high potential impacts, but if you have high adaptive capacity, it might not feel as scary as if you have high impacts and low adaptive capacity. And that's why we bring these 2 together. there's certainly items, stressors and agents that, you can kind of argue for, oh, do they fit on impacts side or adaptive capacity side? And, it's sometimes can be hard to bin things, but I think overall it can be really just helpful to think about kind of what are some of those external pressures versus the internal capacity of the system. We're looking for that balance. So here's an example. This is from a property in like a higher elevation property in Western Massachusetts on Notchview Reservation. So this is a northern hardwoods, red spruce forest. It's actually 3,000 acres. It has a lot of different forest types, old fields. It's a place where people do a lot of recreational skiing. It's a big ski area, as well as just high quality natural habitats. And so, we can think about kind of a fairly northern forest. It's kind of at the southern extent of red spruce and balsam fir range. And so what they did is when they were thinking about, the vulnerability, some of the impacts they identified were, well, there's temperature change, but maybe it's not as great because they're at a higher elevation. So it's going to stay colder there, maybe for a little bit longer than areas farther down slope. But being high elevation, they're already experiencing extreme rain, and then their high elevation puts them at greater susceptibility of wind and ice storms, which have been increasing in the area. And they also have vulnerable tree species like spruce and fir that are more sensitive to climate changes. So they had kind of a number of impacts that they were concerned about. They also I looked at the adaptive capacity of the system, said how resilient is the system, and they identified some things like invasive plants that are already on site, emerald ash borer that's already on site, moderate levels of deer browse that are already affecting the ecosystem. So that was kind of counting against them, that they had less capacity because of some of these other things that are going on in the system. So they used this to evaluate their overall vulnerability, saying, spruce fir is highly vulnerable. They didn't expect it to stick out through the end of the century. Northern hardwoods, not quite as vulnerable, but they did expect it to have regeneration issues by mid-century. And so they're able to think, how does their forest compare to others, maybe in the region or more broadly. So when you do this in the adaptation workbook, you'll have the same process in kind of step 2.2. This will pop up as a window, and you'll be able to do for each of your management topics or other types, you'll do this rating in terms of, what are the potential impacts and what is the adaptive capacity. So with that Notchview example, we would say, okay, well, the potential impacts are fairly disruptive. So we're going to put, these are sliders. We're going to slide our bar over here. And the adaptive capacity is kind of low because of some of those impacts like the emerald ash borer and the invasives. So we're going to slide that over here. And that gives the vulnerability. There's a little chart, and then of the sliders tell you where you are on this chart in terms of, higher impacts, lower adaptive capacity suggests higher vulnerability overall. So the workbook in step 2.2 is going to do, again, you're going to move those sliders and it will do this calculation for you. And you can fiddle around with it in real time if you kind of need to explore that. So the rating is going to be high, moderate, or low in terms of what is there. And, one thing is, you don't have, we want you to use your expertise and judgment. Really, the value of this is just the thinking you're going to do. Don't sweat. We're not going to be coming, tapping you on the virtual shoulder and telling you you're wrong. You know this area, and we really want you to spend the time thinking about what's going to matter in a particular place. And so outlining your ideas is going to be the most useful part. Another useful part is it just helps you, kind of gives you a prompt for thinking about kind of these systems relative to each other. And so, it can be a little bit like bracing, you know, to kind of say, oh, the system, I would rate it highly vulnerable. You know, it gives you kind of an interesting checkpoint for thinking about where your management is going in the future. And so it can be helpful. It can also, like I said, with that notch examples, you can kind of rate systems relative to each other and be thinking about, well, this system is more vulnerable. So maybe, you know, I might be needing to anticipate I'm going to be taking a stronger focus on the more vulnerable systems. It helps you kind of identify kind of what some of those issues are going to be that are really going to maybe rise up in terms of what you need to influence with your adaptation activities. So there's no single answer. You know, don't, if it feels overwhelming, don't stress that you have, you know, you're getting it wrong. You know, just putting these thoughts on kind of paper through the computer are going to be the most important thing. And then another piece is that right now in step 2, we're really thinking about how does climate change affect your site. So stick to climate related impacts. The next step is we're going to think in step 3, next week, we're going to start thinking about how climate change affects your management. And it's really hard to separate these two. I even catch myself all the time, you know, kind of jumping ahead to what I would call step 3, thinking about management. It's hard not to, excuse me. But the reason that we do that is we really want to be able to kind of separate out what are the things, you know, that are just going to happen on their own because of climate change, you know, maybe those things that are less in your control versus sort of the management piece that is more in your control. So really think about, again, this week, as you complete step 2, really think about how is climate change just going to affect the physical space, not your management. Next week, we'll think more about what does that mean for your management. And there's a reason, kind of like I said, there's a reason we do that. We like to break things apart and it will help in the long run. But we just wanted to give you a little bit of a heads up, not to try to do too much too soon. So I'm going to, yeah, pause here. And if people have questions, they might want to chat them in. We have a few more slides to round it out.
Yeah, I was going to say we can spend a much longer amount of time going through everyone's individual questions as well.
Yeah. So yeah, maybe we'll move on and people can chat those in, and then we'll be on again, like I said, after we finish the lecture.
Okay, so that is it. In these last slides, we'll just sort of close the loop and send you off. So when you do get into step 2, we know that some folks are still working on step 1 and inputting their goals and objectives, which is fine. But when you do get to step 2, like, you know, just recapping some of the content we talked about today, just be prepared. You'll see a really long list of climate change impact statements. Now you know how to follow up on those resources, figure out where that information is derived from by clicking that eye icon. Most important is to, like Maria said, start to prioritize those key climate impacts that are the present the greatest risks or vulnerability for each of your management units or forest types, and just kind of move the rest of them out of your way. You can remove them with the X icon. You can always bring them back, but it just sometimes helps to clear the air a little bit if you shore up that list right from the get-go. Be sure to get really specific about how a climate change impact will affect your project area, because that's the meat of the story, right? It's connecting these big regional changes to how that plays out on your local landscape. And if you need to add your own custom climate impact, well, everyone does it. It's totally fine. This is your adaptation plan, okay? So make it worthwhile for yourself. Just a reminder, in those weekly newsletters, we will have links to the video tutorials on how to use the Adaptation Workbook and links to the Adaptation Workbook Cookbook, which is sort of that walkthrough, that PDF that helps you go from screen to screen, and you can jump to whatever step you're in. Next slide. Okay, so your assignment for next time is detailed in your course syllabus. So just open that up, crack it up, crack it open to the week that we're in. The biggest things that you need to do right now is read through that big list of climate change impacts that are presented in front of you and decide if you want to watch a video that's included in the course syllabus. Those are really helpful. Sometimes like I get sick of my inner voice reading and I like to have somebody sort of talk to me. And those video presentations are about a half hour long. So they're really easy to fit into a random brain space that you have during the day. Some of you have spoken up in today's course lecture, but for those that haven't, just reach out to us, contact us. If you see something that's up, just contact us immediately. We'll make time to answer your questions. Get on the phone. I had to do that last week, and well, it just makes it all easier. So we're here for you. Complete step 2, complete your homework in the adaptation workbook as well, and be prepared for next Monday's lecture. Next slide. So next Monday's lecture is February 8th. I should have said in the beginning of the course, hey, welcome to February 1. It's inconceivable that we're already in February, but we will move ahead in February next week, February 8th, and we will introduce step 3, which is again that distinction between your land, those physical attributes of the site, and then how we are managing the land in line with our goals, objectives, and values. Be prepared if you'd like to come to our Wednesday session. It should be on your calendar. It's also listed in the course syllabus. And also, Maria, go back one slide. We really like to meet you guys and gals. It's really helpful just to have that 15-minute, 30-minute conversation. You can ask your questions, we can ask ours, we can make sure everyone's on the same page, and you're going to get everything you need out of the course. So we'll be reaching out to everyone. Please respond and just meet up with us. It can be really short. We just want to get to know you and figure out how you're thinking about climate change in your project. So please schedule a time to meet with an instructor during the next week. And last slide, we'll just leave it on the optional session slide just as a good reminder that this is available to you. It's the first year we're doing this, so definitely join if it's interesting to you and give us feedback if it's not. And there's another topic that you wish we would talk about, and we can make sure that happens another time.